Yes, I mentioned that the U.S. is not a democracy, and it's quite obvious. Again, people mangle words. There are so many words that have been twisted and mangled in the political vocabulary. U.S. is a republic that has a Bill of Rights. There are things like free speech. Nobody's saying that those things aren't important, but just the simple fact that Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump if we were a democracy, the simple fact that Al Gore beat George Bush if we were a democracy. 538 electors decide in the United States how election is run. And you can see this the way the pundits are talking now as we look from the day-to-day election polls and so on. Everything is featured on all of 7 states as if the others don't count at all. And there are many other reasons I could give you, many other reasons why the U.S. is not only not a democracy in that respect, but in others. What country in the world wouldn't give its capital, people in its capital, the same right of representation as people anywhere else in the country? But people in Washington, D.C. do not have senators and they do not have congresspeople. The U.S. is one of the very few countries where if you are foreign born, you cannot become president. So acquired citizenship is not equal to native citizenship. And I could go on and on. Now, the same thing applies to Canada. Canada is more democratic than the U.S., but it's not particularly democratic because of the voting system we have. Voting system, which we adopted from Great Britain, is first past the post, meaning if I get 40%, you get 30%, your brother gets 30%, I win, even though you and your brother, in terms of your political views, may be closer to each other than either of you to me. We do not have in Canada any form of proportional representation, which would reflect how people really feel. And some people would say, well, proportional representation has dangers of its own. Tiny parties can wind up being in the balance of power. But you can say, okay, a party needs, for example, a certain threshold to cross before it can be represented. In Germany, for example, it's 5%. Party gets 5%, and immediately it will get 5% of the seats. And I mention this also because I'm very, very worried. Worried in the U.S. because every indication is that Kamala Harris is going to win the popular vote. But there is no certainty, no similar certainty, that she's going to win the 538 electors, which is not the popular vote, but the people who decide. And I'm very worried about the situation in Canada. Even now, with the Conservatives riding high, 4 Canadians in 7 do not support Monsieur Poilievre and his troop. But we're talking about in terms of a conservative landslide. I don't think there's any such thing as a landslide when 4 people out of 7 are not on your side. And I worry a great deal about this. And I would worry the same way if it were the other way around. If people who or parties that I were supporting were getting undue representation, I think that would be unfair as well. So I'm not, when I talk about the U.S. not being a democracy, Canada not being a democracy, I'm not saying that it's simply because in the present crisis, which is true, it's the right that is getting the benefits. It can work the other way around too. Anyway, apart from we have to go by the system that we have, and I just want to mention, I want to talk about many, many topics as time goes on. With the time that is left to me on Earth, I want to go out howling, but I would say that my main topic once the U.S. election is done is I am Canadian, and I am very, very worried about the state of this country. And I think it's very, very worrisome when people in labor unions think in terms of someone who is as anti-labor historically as Pierre Poilievre, as opposed to thinking about the NDP, which has connections with labor unions. I think what's happening in Canada is the same as in many ways as the U.S. That is, there is a tendency for people when they are unhappy with the present government to say, well, let's give the other fellow a chance. It would be a very wise idea to look at what the other fellow is saying and maybe to recognize that what you have is not so bad.